Is consciousness the final reality? Introduction. There is one question underneath almost every other question you have ever asked. Not, what should I do with my life? Not, why did that happen to me? Not even, what happens when I die? Underneath all of these sits something quieter and stranger. What am I? Not your name, not your job, not the story you tell about yourself at dinner parties. The bare fact of experience itself. The fact that there is a here, at all, a felt sense of being someone, looking out at a world, rather than simply nothing. Tonight we are going to sit with that question for a long time. Not to answer it quickly, and not to hand you a slogan to repeat until you believe it. We are going to walk through it slowly and honestly, from several directions at once, the way you might walk around a large, old building at night, looking at it from the north side, then the east, then the south, letting each angle show you something the others could not. By the end, you may not have a final answer. That is not a failure. Some questions are not meant to be closed. They are meant to be lived inside, the way you live inside a room rather than solving it. Here is the shape of the question, stated as plainly as it can be stated. For most of modern history, the working assumption in science has been that matter comes first, and consciousness comes after, as a kind of side effect. Atoms arrange themselves into molecules, molecules into cells, cells into brains, and once the brain becomes complicated enough, experience simply switches on, the way a light switches on once enough electricity flows through a wire. This is called physicalism, and it deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed, because it has produced real, working knowledge about how memory forms, how mood shifts, how injury changes personality. Any honest exploration of this question has to start by admitting that. But there is another possibility, older in some ways than physicalism, and yet newly interesting again because of things happening at the frontiers of physics and mathematics. This possibility says the order might run the other way. That consciousness might not be a late arrival inside a solid, mechanical universe, but the ground the universe stands on. Not one more ingredient inside reality, but the medium reality is made of, the way a wave is made of water rather than water being made of waves. Tonight we will walk through both of these possibilities carefully, along with a few positions that sit between them, and we will look, without exaggeration, at what the actual evidence and argument on each side really shows, and where it runs out. This will take us through physics, through mathematics, through the history of philosophy, and through the direct, felt experience you are having right now, reading or listening to these words. We will not rush any of it. There is nowhere else to be tonight. Let your body settle now into whatever is holding you. There is no test at the end of this, no argument you are required to win. If your attention drifts, if you lose the thread halfway through a sentence, that is not a problem to correct. Let it happen. The deepest parts of this exploration tend to land more easily in the loose, drowsy mind than in the sharp, gripping one. Before we begin, if this kind of unhurried inquiry is something you want more of, consider subscribing to the channel, so future explorations like this one continue to find you without you needing to search for them. That is the only thing asked of you tonight that requires any effort at all, and even that is entirely optional. Now, let us begin with the case for the other side. Before we ask whether consciousness might be fundamental, we owe it a serious hearing to ask whether it might not be. Chapter 1. The case that consciousness is not fundamental. It would be dishonest to begin this exploration by only presenting the evidence that flatters the conclusion we might personally find beautiful. So let us begin instead with the strongest, most serious version of the opposing view, the view held by the majority of working neuroscientists and many philosophers of mind. This view says consciousness is not fundamental at all. It is a product, an effect, something the brain does, in the same way digestion is something the stomach does. Damage the stomach, and digestion stops. Damage the brain, in very specific and well-documented ways, and consciousness changes, narrows, or disappears entirely. The evidence for this view is not trivial. A blow to the head can erase decades of memory. A tumor pressing on a particular region can alter someone's personality so completely that people who knew them for years describe them as having become a different person. Certain drugs, absorbed into brain tissue within minutes, can dissolve the sense of a separate self almost completely, replacing it with a feeling of vast, boundaryless unity, and then, just as reliably, restore the ordinary sense of self once the drug clears the body. If consciousness were truly independent of matter, existing prior to and separate from the brain, why would altering brain chemistry alter consciousness so precisely, so predictably, so reversibly? Physicalists point out that every mental event we have ever been able to measure has a corresponding physical event alongside it. Every emotion has a hormonal signature. Every memory has a corresponding pattern of connection strength between neurons. Every documented case of altered consciousness, whether through injury, illness, anesthesia, or meditation, correlates with a measurable change in brain activity. From this angle, the idea that consciousness might be fundamental, existing prior to and independent of matter, looks like an unnecessary complication added on to a simpler explanation that already accounts for the data. Why propose a mysterious extra ingredient when brain activity alone appears to explain everything we can actually observe? There is also a deeper argument physicalists make, one worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It is called the evolutionary argument. Brains did not appear all at once, fully formed. They evolved gradually, from simpler nervous systems, from clusters of a few cells capable only of detecting light or chemical gradients, up through increasingly complex arrangements, over hundreds of millions of years. If consciousness tracks brain complexity this closely, appearing dimly in simple creatures and richly in complex ones, doesn't that suggest consciousness is simply what complexity produces, rather than something separate that complexity merely channels or reveals? This is a genuinely strong argument, and it deserves to be held seriously rather than waved away. Anyone claiming that consciousness is fundamental owes physicalism a real answer to it, not a dismissal. Here is the honest answer, as far as it can be given honestly. The physicalist account is extremely good at describing correlation. It has mapped, with impressive precision, which physical changes accompany which mental changes. What it has not done, and what no physicalist account has yet done despite more than a century of trying, is explain why any physical process should be accompanied by experience at all, rather than simply happening in the dark, the way a calculator processes numbers without anything it is like to be a calculator doing so. This gap has a name, mentioned earlier in our journey together on this channel, the hard problem of consciousness, and it remains, by the admission of physicalists themselves, unsolved. Correlation between brain states and mental states has been shown 1,000 times over. Why there is a felt, inner quality to any of it at all, rather than pure mechanism operating with no inner lights switched on anywhere, has not been shown even once. So the honest position, at the opening of this long night, is this. Physicalism explains an enormous amount. It explains which, when, and how much. It has never yet explained why there is anything it is like to be you at all. That gap is not a minor omission waiting for a future paper to close it. Some serious philosophers believe it may be a structural gap, the kind that no amount of additional data about neurons and chemistry could ever close, because the question it is being asked to answer sits in a different category altogether from the kind of question physical description is built to answer. Hold both of these facts together now, without rushing to resolve the tension between them. Physicalism has earned a great deal of trust through its predictive power, and physicalism has, so far, failed to answer the single most basic question anyone could ask about consciousness. Both are true. Neither cancels the other out. We are simply standing, honestly, at the edge of what is currently known, and what is currently known runs out sooner than most people realize. From here, we begin walking through the paths that open up once you take that gap seriously rather than papering over it. Chapter 2, The Observer Effect, examined carefully. If there is one place in modern physics where the old, comfortable wall between observer and observed has visibly cracked, it is in the strange results of quantum experiments. We touched on this briefly before on this channel, but tonight we go slower and more carefully, because this deserves more than a passing mention. Fire a single electron at a barrier with two narrow openings, and let it land on a screen behind. Do this many times, one electron at a time, with no way for the electrons to interact with each other, and a pattern builds up on the screen that looks exactly like the interference pattern you would get from two overlapping waves of water, bands of light and dark, rippling across the screen. This is strange enough on its own. Each individual electron appears to have passed through both openings at once, as a spread of possibility, only resolving into a single point the moment it strikes the screen. Now place a detector at the openings, a device whose only purpose is to record which opening each electron actually passed through. The interference pattern disappears immediately. The electrons now land in two simple clusters, exactly matching the two openings, exactly as basic intuition expected from the very beginning. The moment information about the electron's path becomes available anywhere in the system, the wave-like behavior collapses into simple, particle-like behavior. It is worth being very precise here, because this result gets exaggerated constantly in popular explanations, and exaggeration does not serve the truth, even when the truth is already strange enough without embellishment. Physicists have worked hard to determine exactly what causes this collapse. It is not, as early explanations sometimes suggested, that the detector physically bumps the electron off course. Careful versions of the experiment, using methods that minimize any physical disturbance to the electron, still show the same collapse the moment path information becomes available anywhere in the system, even if no human being ever looks at that information directly. This detail matters enormously, and honesty requires including it. It suggests that what collapses the wave of possibility is not necessarily a conscious mind looking at anything. It may be the presence of information becoming recorded anywhere in a physical system capable of retaining it, whether or not any consciousness ever accesses that record. This is the single most important qualification in this entire chapter, and it is the reason serious physicists remain divided, sometimes sharply, over what the observer effect actually tells us about consciousness. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics require no reference to consciousness whatsoever. They propose that any physical interaction capable of leaving a permanent record, a photon striking a detector, an air molecule bouncing off a table, is enough to collapse a wave of possibility into a definite outcome, with no conscious mind needed anywhere in the process. Under this kind of interpretation, the phrase, observer effect, is somewhat misleading, since it does not require an observer in the ordinary sense of a mind that is aware. It requires only an interaction, a kind of measurement that does not need to be witnessed by anyone to occur. Other interpretations disagree, and take more seriously the strange fact that a physical record, sitting unread in a sealed drawer, seems, in certain careful thought experiments, to remain suspended in an unusual logical state until someone actually opens the drawer and looks. These interpretations keep the door open to the idea that consciousness itself, not merely physical interaction, plays some genuinely special role in collapsing possibility into actuality. This debate has continued for a century among people who have spent their entire careers doing nothing but studying this question, and it remains unresolved. Fairness requires saying plainly that no one, including this exploration, can responsibly claim it has been settled in either direction. What can be said honestly, without overreach, is this. The observer effect proves that reality, at its smallest observable scale, does not behave like a collection of tiny solid objects sitting in fixed places, entirely indifferent to interaction. It behaves like a field of open possibility that becomes definite only through some kind of interaction, whether that interaction ultimately requires consciousness or not. This alone is enough to unsettle the old, simple picture of a universe made of hard little billiard balls, bumping into each other in ways that would happen identically whether or not anyone or anything was ever there to record them. Whether this unsettling of the old picture reaches all the way up to prove that consciousness itself, and not merely physical interaction generally, is fundamental to reality, remains genuinely open. We will not resolve that tonight, because it has not been resolved by anyone, anywhere, despite a century of extremely careful attention from people who wanted very badly to resolve it. What we can do is hold the door open, honestly, rather than pretending it is already closed in either direction, and continue walking toward the other pieces of evidence and argument that bear on this same large question. Let your body continue to rest, heavier now than it was at the start of this chapter. There is no need to hold on to the precise details of interference patterns or detector experiments. What matters is the shape of what has been shown, that certainty and solidity, at the deepest level physics has been able to examine, are not quite what they first appear to be, and that the question of whether mind plays a special role in that uncertainty remains, honestly, still open. Chapter 3. Gödel and the limits of any self-contained system. Set physics aside for a while, and turn instead to a very different kind of question, one asked not with telescopes or particle detectors, but with pure, careful logic. In the early 1930s, a mathematician named Kurt Gödel proved something that quietly reshaped the foundations of mathematics itself, and which, though it was never intended to say anything directly about consciousness, has continued to draw philosophers of mind back to it, again and again, for a reason worth examining carefully. Gödel showed that in any formal system rich enough to describe basic arithmetic, there will always be true statements that the system cannot prove using only its own internal rules. This is not a temporary gap that better mathematics might someday close. It is a structural feature built into what it means for a system to be both consistent and rich enough to be interesting. A system can be simple and completely self-verifying, or it can be complex and useful, but it cannot be both at once. Somewhere, in any sufficiently rich system, there will be a truth visible only from outside the system, never provable using the system's own resources alone. The temptation to apply this directly to the mind is old, and it deserves a caution before we go any further. Gödel's theorem is a precise result about formal mathematical systems built from symbols and rules. The mind is not a formal system in that precise technical sense, and treating the analogy as a mathematical proof about consciousness would be an overreach that serious logicians rightly criticize when they encounter it in popular writing. This needs to be said plainly, because it is easy and tempting to borrow the authority of a rigorous mathematical proof and smuggle it into a much softer, more speculative claim about the mind, without admitting the borrowing has occurred. With that caution clearly stated, the analogy still has value, as an analogy rather than a proof, because it points at something structurally similar to a pattern you can actually notice directly in your own experience, right now, without needing any mathematics at all. Notice that you are capable of observing your own thoughts. Watch a thought arise, perhaps a worry, or a plan, or a memory. Now notice that something in you is aware of that thought without being identical to it. That something did not have to argue the thought down or defeat it in debate in order to see it clearly. It simply noticed. Here is the structural echo, offered carefully, as an echo rather than a proof. If the thinking mind, the part of you that reasons, plans, and argues with itself, functions something like a self-contained system, then, by the shape of Gödel's insight, we would not expect that system to be able to fully see or verify itself using only its own thinking. And indeed, when you try to catch your own thinking mind in the act of fully explaining itself, using nothing but more thinking, you tend to find an infinite regress, thought explaining thought, with no final, self-sufficient bottom ever reached. And yet something in you does seem to notice this regress happening, without itself being one more link in the same chain. That noticing does not argue. It does not add another thought to the pile. It simply witnesses the pile as a pile, the way you might notice fog without needing to become fog yourself in order to see it clearly. This is remarkably close to how contemplative traditions across many centuries and many cultures have described the difference between thought and awareness, long before Gödel or modern logic existed. They describe a witnessing presence that is not one more thought among many, but the space in which all thoughts, including confused, contradictory, or incomplete ones, are noticed. Gödel's proof does not establish this witnessing presence as a scientific fact, but it does offer a rigorous, independently discovered mathematical structure that rhymes, unmistakably, with something contemplatives have described from direct experience for a very long time. That rhyme is worth taking seriously as suggestive, even while resisting the temptation to call it proof. There is a gentler, more direct way to test any of this yourself, right now, without needing to trust anyone's argument, including this one. Simply notice, for a moment, whatever thought is currently passing through your mind. Now ask quietly, without needing an answer in words, what is noticing this thought? Do not chase the question aggressively. Let it simply sit there, the way you would let a stone sit at the bottom of still water, and see what, if anything, becomes apparent on its own. You may find, as many people across many centuries have reported finding, that there is no thought you can locate that is doing the noticing. There is simply noticing itself, open, quiet, without a visible edge. Let that quiet noticing continue now, underneath whatever remains of your attention to these words. We turn next to a physicist who took this same basic structure, an observer that cannot be fully folded into the system it observes, and extended it all the way out to the scale of the entire universe. If tonight's slow unfolding is giving you something worth returning to, subscribing to the channel means the next chapter of this exploration will find you without effort on your part. Chapter 4. Wheeler's Universe and the Question of Cosmic Participation. As the previous chapters explored, what might that imply about the universe as a whole, not just about individual electrons in a laboratory, but about the vast unfolding of cosmic history itself? Wheeler proposed what he called the participatory universe, and illustrated it with a genuinely strange thought experiment involving light from extremely distant sources, light that had already been traveling toward Earth for billions of years, long before any measuring instrument on this planet existed to eventually receive it. According to the mathematics of quantum mechanics, choices made today, in how that ancient light is measured, appear to influence which path the light is understood to have taken across all those billions of years in the past. Wheeler summarized the strangeness because it is easily inflated into something the physics does not actually support. Wheeler was not suggesting that human observers are personally, individually responsible for creating distant galaxies through some act of cosmic will. He was suggesting something more careful and arguably still stranger, that the property of being definite, of being one particular way rather than remaining an open field of possibilities, might not be something the universe possesses independently of observation occurring anywhere within it, at any point in its history. This remains a genuinely disputed idea within physics, not a settled consensus, and fairness requires stating that plainly. A number of physicists have developed interpretations of quantum mechanics, and of Wheeler's delayed choice experiments specifically, that do not require consciousness, or given the presence of any observer capable of experience, to explain the results. Under these interpretations, physical interaction and information recording, not consciousness itself, are doing all the necessary work, and Wheeler's more provocative language about a participatory universe is treated as a poetic overreach beyond what the mathematics strictly requires. But Wheeler himself, one of the most respected physicists of his generation, having worked directly alongside Einstein and Bohr, continued taking the more radical reading seriously until the end of his career, and he was not a careless thinker prone to mysticism for its own sake. He illustrated his view with a simple image, a large U-shape representing billions of years of cosmic history, with a small eye drawn at one end, looking back across the entire arc. Not a passive latecomer observing a finished story from a safe distance at the very end, but something whose presence, in some manner still not fully agreed upon even among specialists, participates in bringing the earlier parts of the story into definite existence in the first place. Consciousness arises from the universe, and in some looping, still mysterious way, the definite universe arises from consciousness. Not two separate one-directional facts, but possibly one continuous loop. Notice, honestly, where this leaves us. We have, on one side, a genuinely rigorous, widely respected physicist proposing that observation may be woven into the deep structure of cosmic history itself, not merely as a curiosity of small particle physics, but as something with implications for how the universe as a whole becomes real. And we have, on the other side, equally rigorous physicists who interpret the identical experimental results without requiring this conclusion at all. Both groups have access to the same data. They disagree about what the data ultimately means. This is not a case where one side has simply failed to do their homework. It is a case where extremely careful people, looking at the same strange results, have reached different conclusions about what those results are ultimately telling us about the relationship between mind and cosmos. Given this honest state of disagreement, what is available to you tonight is not certainty, but a widened sense of possibility. It is no longer obviously true, the way it once seemed obviously true a century ago, that consciousness is simply a late, minor accident occurring inside an already finished, in different universes. Serious physicists, using serious methods, continue to take seriously the alternative possibility that consciousness and cosmos may be far more entangled with one another than the old picture ever allowed. Whether that entanglement rises all the way to consciousness is fundamental to reality, or stops at physical interaction of any kind, conscious or not, resolves quantum possibility, remains an open question that this exploration cannot honestly close for you tonight, and that no one, in truth, has yet closed for anyone. Rest in that openness for a moment. Not every question needs to resolve into a flat, certain answer in order to be worth asking. Sometimes the value of a question is in how it stretches the space of what you consider possible, loosening old, unexamined certainties, even before any new certainty arrives to replace them. Let your own certainties loosen a little now, gently, the way a held breath finally releases. We turn next to a completely different discipline, the careful study of awareness itself, as described by people across history who spent their lives investigating it directly, from the inside, rather than through instruments and experiments. If this way of holding an unresolved question, patiently, without forcing a premature conclusion, is valuable to you, subscribing to the channel keeps this kind of long, careful exploration finding you. Chapter 5, Idealism, and the old argument that the mind comes first. Long before quantum mechanics existed, a strand of philosophy now called idealism made a case that consciousness, not matter, is the fundamental reality, and that matter, whatever it ultimately is, arises within or depends upon mind rather than the reverse. This is worth presenting carefully and fairly, on its own terms, before folding it back into everything else explored tonight. One of the clearest historical statements of this view came from the 18th century philosopher George Berkeley, who argued that to exist, for anything at all, ultimately means to be perceived, or to be a perceiver. A tree in an empty forest, Berkeley argued, does not exist as a solid, mind-independent object floating free of any awareness whatsoever. It exists as a coherent, orderly pattern of possible perception, sustained, in his particular framework, by an infinite mind, which he identified with God, that perceives all things continuously, ensuring the world remains stable and consistent even when no finite human mind happens to be looking at any particular part of it in any particular moment. Berkeley's argument is easy to caricature, and it deserves better than caricature. He was not claiming that trees vanish the instant you turn your back on them, leaving a strange, patchy universe full of holes wherever no one happens to be looking. He was making a more careful claim, that the very idea of a mind-independent object, existing with absolutely no relationship to any awareness whatsoever, either finite or infinite, might be a kind of category error, an attempt to describe something that, on close inspection, turns out to be self-contradictory or at least unverifiable, since any attempt to check whether something exists independently of all mind requires, itself, an act of mind to perform the checking. This same basic intuition reappears, in different vocabulary, across a number of the world's oldest contemplative and philosophical traditions, particularly within certain schools of Vedanta in India, which describe a single, undivided awareness, often called by a term meaning pure consciousness or pure being, as the actual substrate of all experience reality, with the entire perceived world of separate objects, and separate selves arising within this awareness the way images arise within a dream, real as experience while they last, but never separate, substantialize from the awareness in which they appear. It would be intellectually dishonest to present idealism as though it faces no serious objections, because it faces several, and taking the question seriously means naming them plainly. The most immediate objection is the one physicalism raises so effectively in the opening chapter of this exploration. If mind is fundamental and matter merely derivative, why does damaging the physical brain so reliably and specifically alter or extinguish the very mind that idealism claims should be more basic than the brain itself? Idealist philosophers have offered responses to this, some more persuasive than others, generally arguing that the brain functions more like a receiver or filter that shapes and localizes a deeper, more universal awareness, rather than a generator that produces awareness from nothing. In the same way damaging a radio changes or destroys the particular signal you receive without that damage implying the radio itself manufactured the broadcast from nothing. This response is coherent, but it remains a philosophical argument rather than an experimentally demonstrated fact, and honesty requires saying so. A second serious objection concerns the shared, consistent nature of the world we all seem to inhabit together. If reality depends fundamentally on mind, why does the world appear so stubbornly consistent across billions of separate minds, all of whom report encountering the same physical laws, the same historical events, the same stable objects, regardless of their private beliefs or wishes about how they would prefer the world to behave? Idealists have offered answers to this as well, generally proposing some version of a single, shared, underlying field of consciousness within which individual minds are localized expressions, rather than millions of entirely separate, private realities happening to coincidentally align. We touched on a structurally similar idea when discussing quantum Darwinism in earlier explorations on this channel, the notion that certain patterns become redundantly stable across a shared environment, and idealist philosophers sometimes reach for comparable structural explanations for why a mind-grounded reality would still appear stable and consistent across observers, rather than chaotic and private. None of this settles the debate between idealism and physicalism, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. What can honestly be said is that idealism is not a fringe, unserious position easily dismissed by modern thought. It has been argued carefully, by serious thinkers, across many centuries and cultures, and it remains defended today by a number of contemporary philosophers of mind, precisely because the hard problem of consciousness, examined in the opening chapter of this exploration, has never been closed by the physicalist alternative. When the leading alternative theory has a well-known, unsolved gap at its very center, older theories that avoid that particular gap, even if they open different gaps of their own, deserve a fair, ongoing hearing rather than casual dismissal. Let this fair hearing settle into you now, without requiring you to adopt idealism as your final conclusion tonight. You are not being asked to believe anything. You are simply being shown, honestly, that intelligent, careful people have found real reasons to consider consciousness the ground of being rather than a late derivative of matter, and that this view remains, even now, a live, defensible position rather than a comfortable fantasy already refuted by modern science. We turn next to a position that tries to find a middle path between these two extremes, one that has been gaining serious attention among philosophers of mind in recent decades. If tonight's careful, even-handed walk through these old and difficult questions is valuable to you, subscribing to the channel will keep bringing you more of the same unhurried, honest exploration. Chapter 6: Panpsychism and the idea of consciousness all the way down. Between the strict physicalist claim that consciousness emerges only very late, only in sufficiently complex brains, and the strict idealist claim that consciousness is the sole fundamental reality with matter as its derivative, sits a third position that has drawn increasing serious attention from philosophers of mind in recent decades. It is called Panpsychism, and its core claim, stated plainly, is this: consciousness, in some very basic, minimal form, is not something that switches on only at a certain threshold of biological complexity. It may be a fundamental feature of matter itself, present, in some rudimentary way, in even the simplest physical systems, with complex consciousness like yours arising not from nothing, but from the combination and organization of these simpler, more basic forms of experience already present at every level of physical reality. This position has an unusual appeal, precisely because it takes seriously a problem that both physicalism and idealism, in their own ways, struggle with. Physicalism struggles to explain how experience could arise from something, matter, that is defined as entirely lacking any inner, experiential quality whatsoever. If matter has absolutely no experiential aspect at any level, panpsychists ask, how does combining enough of it eventually produce experience from nothing? Any more than combining enough silence eventually produces a sound. Idealism, meanwhile, struggles to explain why a fundamentally mental reality would organize itself into something behaving so consistently, so lawfully, so mechanically, at the scale of physics and chemistry, if mind alone were truly all there was to it. Panpsychism attempts to dissolve both problems at once by proposing that the fundamental units of physical reality, whatever they ultimately are, already carry some minimal spark of experience as an intrinsic feature, alongside their more familiar physical properties like mass, charge, and spin. Under this view, an electron does not have rich, human-like thoughts, feelings, or self-awareness. But it might have something, some vanishingly simple flicker of raw experience, so minimal it bears almost no resemblance to anything we would recognize as consciousness in ordinary language, and yet not strictly nothing either. Complex consciousness, under this view, is not created from nothing once brains become sufficiently intricate. It is a highly organized combination of countless simpler experiential elements already present throughout the physical substrate, combined into a single, unified, richer experience through whatever specific organizational process the brain provides. The most serious objection to panpsychism is sometimes called the combination problem, and it deserves to be named directly rather than glossed over. It is not obvious, even if you accept that simple physical elements carry some minimal form of experience, how combining many separate simple experiences produces one single, unified, richer experience, rather than simply producing a crowd of separate simple experiences sitting side by side, never actually merging into the felt unity you experience right now as a single, coherent perspective. This is a genuinely difficult technical problem within panpsychist philosophy, and it has not been fully solved, a fact its serious proponents readily admit rather than concealing. What panpsychism offers, even without fully solving this combination problem, is a way of taking the hard problem of consciousness seriously without discarding the deep continuity and lawfulness of physical science that physicalism has spent centuries carefully establishing. It suggests that the fundamental building blocks of the universe, studied so precisely by physics, might carry a dimension that physics, by its own chosen methods, was never actually designed to detect. Physics measures mass, charge, position, momentum, all the external, structural, relational properties of matter. It was never built, from the very beginning, as a method for measuring the inner, felt quality of anything, because physics deliberately restricts itself to what can be externally measured and mathematically modeled. Hence psychics argue this means physics's silence on the inner nature of matter should not be mistaken for evidence that matter lacks any inner nature. It may simply be evidence that physics was never asking that particular question in the first place, the way a thermometer's silence about the taste of water should not be mistaken for evidence that water has no taste. This is a genuinely useful reframe, worth carrying forward even if you remain uncertain about panpsychism as a complete theory. The absence of evidence for something, within a method specifically designed to look for something else entirely, is not the same as evidence of absence. Physics has never claimed to have searched for and failed to find an inner, experiential dimension to matter. It has simply never been built as a tool for that particular search. This leaves the question of what matter is like, from the inside, if it is like anything at all, genuinely open, in a way that is easy to forget once you have absorbed, quietly and without noticing, the assumption that physics has already covered every important question there is to ask about reality. Let your own mind rest now in this genuine openness, rather than reaching for a final, settled answer before you are ready to sleep. We have now walked through physicalism, idealism, and panpsychism, each one a serious, carefully argued position, each one facing real, unresolved objections, none of them able to claim final, uncontested victory over the others. This is simply where careful thought about consciousness currently stands, honestly reported, without exaggeration in either direction. We turn next to a philosopher who, centuries before any of these modern labels existed, built an entire system attempting to dissolve the distinction between mind and matter altogether, not by declaring one more fundamental than the other, but by arguing that the distinction itself was never quite as solid as it first appears. If this careful, honest walk through difficult, unresolved territory is something you want to keep returning to, subscribing to the channel means it will keep finding you. Chapter 7. Spinoza's Single Substance. In the middle of the 17th century, a philosopher named Baruch Spinoza wrote a work so quietly radical that it was banned during his own lifetime, denounced by religious authorities across Europe who recognized, correctly, that its implications reached far beyond the abstract philosophy it appeared, on the surface, to be. The work was called Ethics, though it reads more like a careful geometric proof than anything resembling ordinary philosophical prose, built from a small number of precise definitions and axioms, with every later claim following logically from what came before, in the disciplined style Euclid once used to build an entire system of geometry from just a few self-evident starting points. Spinoza's central claim, stripped down to its simplest form, is this: there is only one substance in all of existence. He called this substance, interchangeably, God or nature, deliberately refusing to separate the two words, insisting they name the very same underlying reality, viewed from two different angles that human language happened to have developed separately, out of habit rather than necessity. Everything that exists, every stone, every thought, every ocean, every mind, is not a separate thing standing apart from this one substance. Everything is a particular, temporary expression, a specific mode, of this single, unified substance, in the same way a wave is a temporary expression of an ocean, or a fold is a temporary expression of a single piece of cloth, never actually separate from the material it is folded out of. This had striking consequences for how Spinoza understood mind and body specifically, consequences that echo remarkably well against the modern debate between physicalism, idealism, and panpsychism explored across the previous chapters. If there truly is only one substance, then mind and matter cannot be two fundamentally separate kinds of stuff, awkwardly bridged together across some mysterious, unexplained gap, as earlier philosophers, most famously René Descartes, had proposed. Spinoza argued instead that mind and matter are two different attributes, two different ways of describing the very same single underlying substance. Every physical event has a corresponding mental aspect. Every mental event has a corresponding physical aspect. Not because one somehow causes the other across some strange bridge connecting two separate realms, but because, at the deepest level, they are the very same event, described in two different languages, from two different vantage points, the way a single symphony can be described accurately either in the language of musical notes, or in the language of air pressure waves, without either description being more fundamentally true than the other, and without needing to explain how notes cause air pressure or the reverse, because they were never two separate things requiring a causal bridge in the first place. Notice how elegantly this dissolves, rather than resolves through further argument, several of the tensions explored across the previous chapters. Physicalism struggles to explain how mind arises from matter, treated as a separate substance. Idealism struggles to explain how matter arises from mind, treated as a separate substance. Panpsychism struggles to explain how many small, separate flickers of simple experience combine into one unified experience. Spinoza's framework sidesteps all three struggles at once, not by cleverly solving each one, but by rejecting the underlying premise that mind and matter were ever two truly separate substances requiring a bridge, a derivation, or a combination in the first place. There has only ever been one substance, and mind and matter are simply the two attributes to which we, limited in our angle of view, happen to perceive and describe it. It would be inaccurate and unfair to claim that Spinoza's argument settles the modern scientific debate, because Spinoza was doing metaphysics through pure logical argument from a small set of starting definitions, not empirical science, and his conclusions cannot be treated as proven simply because certain later findings in physics happened to rhyme, centuries afterward, with the shape of his framework. That would overstate what his careful, purely logical argument can actually deliver on its own terms, and it would understate the genuine philosophical labor his argument still requires from anyone who wants to accept his starting definitions and follow his reasoning honestly, rather than simply borrowing his conclusion because it happens to sound appealing. But it remains genuinely notable, and worth sitting with, that a philosopher working with nothing but careful logical argument in the 1600s arrived at a framework that so closely resembles the structure suggested by certain interpretations of quantum entanglement and cosmic participation explored earlier tonight, developed independently, centuries later, through entirely different methods. When two entirely separate paths of careful inquiry, separated by hundreds of years and using completely different tools, arrive at a similar destination, it does not prove the destination correct. But it does suggest the destination deserves serious attention rather than casual dismissal, because convergence of this kind, across independent methods, is exactly the pattern careful thinkers should learn to notice and take seriously, even while continuing to demand more direct evidence before treating it as settled. Spinoza himself seemed to regard his own system not primarily as an abstract intellectual puzzle, but as a practical path toward a specific, describable kind of peace. He believed most human suffering arises from mistakenly imagining ourselves as separate, isolated fragments, buffeted helplessly by external forces we cannot understand or influence. He believed that clearly seeing our actual nature as expressions of one single, eternal substance rather than separate, vulnerable fragments, produces a distinct, describable calm, which he called, in the closing pages of his great work, a blessedness, arising not from getting everything we want, but from finally seeing clearly what we, and everything else, actually are. Let that calm settle into you now, in whatever way it wants to arrive, without forcing it. You do not need to accept every one of Spinoza's formal definitions to receive something real from what he was ultimately pointing toward. Notice, gently, that the sense of being a separate fragment, unsupported and alone, has perhaps always been a slight exaggeration, laid over something more continuous and whole than the fragment ever realized while it was busy defending its own separateness. We turn next to the question of how a genuinely shared, stable, agreed-upon world could arise from any of the strange, open, foundational pictures explored across this long night. If this slow, careful walk through centuries of careful thought continues to be valuable to you, subscribing to the channel keeps this kind of unhurried exploration finding you. Chapter 8. Why the world still feels so solid. A serious question has been quietly following us across this entire exploration, and it deserves to be addressed directly before we go any further. If the deepest layer of physical reality is genuinely open, probabilistic, and possibly entangled with observation or awareness in some fundamental way, why does the ordinary world feel so completely solid, so stubbornly consistent, so entirely indifferent to anyone's private wishes or beliefs about how it should behave? You cannot wish a wall into becoming a door. Two people looking at the same table see the same table, in the same place, with the same shape, regardless of what either of them privately believes or hopes to see instead. A relatively recent area of physics research, called quantum Darwinism, offers a genuinely useful and carefully grounded answer to exactly this puzzle, and it deserves to be walked through slowly, because it resolves a tension that might otherwise make everything explored tonight feel unstable, arbitrary, or too good to be taken seriously. Large, everyday objects are never truly sealed off from their surroundings. They are constantly interacting with an enormous number of other particles nearby, mere molecules, photons of light, all continuously bouncing off, reflecting from, and interacting with the object in question. Each one of these countless interactions functions, in a very real sense, as a tiny measurement, extracting and carrying away a small piece of information about the object's current state. Quantum Darwinism proposes that only certain particular states of any given object are stable enough to survive this constant bombardment of tiny measurements without being scrambled into incoherence. These especially stable states get copied, redundantly, again and again, into the surrounding environment, and printed faithfully onto countless separate air molecules and photons, each one carrying an independent, accurate record of the very same basic information. Because this information becomes so redundantly, so thoroughly copied throughout the entire surrounding environment, any observer who samples even a small fraction of that environment, whether by looking directly at the object, or simply by having light from the object reach their eyes, will reliably encounter the very same stable, dominant state. This is why you and another person, looking at the same table from different angles, both reliably see the same table, rather than two different, private, disconnected tables shaped by nothing more than personal expectation. This offers a genuinely elegant, physically grounded resolution to the apparent tension running through this whole exploration. The everyday world you experience as fixed and solid is not fixed and solid because probability and openness were never actually present at its deepest foundation. It is fixed and solid because certain outcomes, out of the vast underlying field of possibility, happen to be especially good at surviving and reliably replicating themselves throughout the surrounding environment, in a manner bearing at least a structural resemblance to how certain biological traits become dominant and widespread across a population through natural selection, which is precisely why the phrase quantum Darwinism was chosen for this process. This does not remove the strangeness explored across the earlier chapters of tonight's long walk. It contextualizes it. The underlying field beneath the visible, stable world remains genuinely open, genuinely probabilistic, and according to some serious interpretations, genuinely entangled with observation in ways not yet fully agreed upon by physicists. But the visible, stable world built on top of that foundation is not therefore fragile or illusory. It is a genuine, hard-won stability, earned through the sheer redundancy of countless real interactions, the same way a rumor becomes a reliably known fact. Once enough independent people have heard, confirmed, and repeated it to one another, even though the underlying event the rumor describes remains, at bottom, just one particular thing that happened, out of everything that could have happened instead. There is something quietly reassuring available here, particularly at this hour, as your own body continues settling deeper into rest. The solidity and continuity of your life, your relationships, your sense of who you are, need not be understood as fragile illusions, one strong gust away from shattering. They have been built, redundantly, through countless genuine interactions, exactly the way the stability of the walls around you right now has been built through countless genuine interactions between light and air and matter, layered upon each other until something reliably solid emerged. And yet, underneath that genuine, earned stability, an open foundation remains, one that is not rigid, not closed, not finished, a foundation that permits you to keep changing, keep growing, keep becoming something subtly different tomorrow than you are tonight, without any of that openness ever threatening the coherence that makes you recognizably, reliably you. Let this reassurance settle now into whatever part of you still holds tension. Stability and openness were never actually opposites, competing for the same limited space. They have always worked together, quietly, at every scale, from the smallest measured particle to the largest studied galaxy, and they continue working together now, within you, exactly as you are. We return, in the chapter ahead, to the direct, felt experience of awareness itself, the one piece of evidence in this entire exploration that you do not need any physics or philosophy to access, because it has been available to you this whole time, underneath every word. Chapter 9. The one piece of evidence you already have. Everything explored across this long night so far has come from outside you. Experiments performed in laboratories you have never visited. Proofs written by mathematicians long dead. Philosophical systems built by people living centuries before you were born. All of it offered honestly, with its genuine strengths and its genuine, unresolved gaps clearly named, rather than smoothed over for the sake of a tidier story. But there is one piece of evidence relevant to tonight's central question that requires none of this outside material at all, because it is not a report about something that happened somewhere else. It is happening right now, as directly and immediately as anything can happen. You are aware. Right now, in this moment, there is something it is like to be you, reading or listening to these words, in this particular room, at this particular hour. This is not a theory requiring outside confirmation. It is the single most immediate, most certain fact available to you, more certain, in a strict sense, than any external fact about physics or philosophy could ever be, because every other fact you know about the world had to first arrive by passing through this very awareness in order to be known at all. You cannot doubt that you are aware without the doubting itself being one more thing you are aware of, which is precisely why philosophers, going back centuries, have treated the bare fact of awareness as the single most secure starting point available to human knowledge, more secure even than the existence of the physical world itself, since the physical world is known only through awareness, while awareness is known directly, without any intermediary standing between it and itself. This might sound like a small, almost trivial observation, easily passed over. It is not small. Sit with it directly for a moment, without rushing past it the way this fact gets rushed past almost constantly in ordinary daily life. There is a felt quality to this exact moment, a warmth or coolness in the air around you, a particular quality of light or darkness in the room, a weight to your own body, resting wherever it happens to be resting right now. None of this is a description of something happening elsewhere, reported to you secondhand. It is happening directly as itself, right here, right now, and you are the one place in the entire universe, as far as you can ever directly verify, where this particular unfolding is actually occurring. Every single position explored across this long night, physicalism, idealism, panpsychism, Spinoza's single substance, every one of them is ultimately an attempt to explain this one, single, undeniable fact, that experience exists at all, here, now, in you. They differ dramatically in how they explain it. They do not differ at all in acknowledging that it needs explaining, because unlike almost anything else in nature, its simple presence cannot be waved away as an illusion, since even calling it an illusion would require something to experience the illusion as an illusion, which brings you right back to the very thing you were trying to explain away. This is why some serious philosophers argue that consciousness holds a peculiar, almost unique status among all the things the theory of reality is required to explain. Every other phenomenon, gravity, chemistry, biological growth, can be fully described in terms of structure, relationship, and behavior, without ever needing to also explain why there is something it feels like from the inside for that structure to exist. Consciousness is the one phenomenon that seems to demand exactly that additional, inward explanation, and it is precisely this demand that the hard problem, named back in the opening chapter, points toward. No theory explored tonight has fully answered that demand. But your own direct awareness, right now, is not waiting for any theory to answer it in order to already simply, undeniably be present. This is, in the end, the quiet ground beneath every argument walked through across this long night. You do not need physics to know you are aware. You do not need Gödel, or Wheeler, or Spinoza, or been present the entire time you have been listening, the one piece of evidence in this whole long exploration that was never second-hand, because it was never anywhere else to begin with except exactly where you already are. Let your attention rest in that direct, immediate fact now, without needing to turn it into another thought, another argument, another position to defend. Simply notice that there is noticing happening. That is enough. It was always enough, long before tonight's exploration began, and it will remain enough long after these particular words have faded from your memory entirely. In the chapters ahead, we bring everything explored so far into a single, honest weighing, before turning, finally, toward rest. Chapter 10, An Honest Weighing. We have now walked, carefully and at length, through several serious, independently developed positions on the question this entire night has been circling. It would be dishonest to pretend, at this point, that a single, tidy conclusion is waiting to be revealed, tying every thread together into certainty. That is not where careful, honest inquiry into this question currently stands, and pretending otherwise would betray the very honesty this exploration has tried to maintain from its opening chapter onward. So let us weigh what has actually been shown, plainly, without inflating it in either direction. Physicalism has earned real, substantial credibility through its extraordinary success at predicting and explaining correlations between brain states and mental states. It remains the dominant working framework across most of neuroscience and much of philosophy of mind, and any position that hopes to challenge it seriously must contend with the sheer weight of evidence supporting how tightly mind and brain appear correlated. And physicalism has never yet closed the hard problem, the question of why any physical process should be accompanied by felt experience at all, rather than proceeding in the dark. This gap is acknowledged even by many physicalists themselves, who continue working on the problem precisely because it remains unresolved rather than settled. The observer effect in quantum physics has genuinely shown that reality, at its smallest scales, does not behave like a collection of fixed, definite objects indifferent to interaction. Whether this rises to proving that consciousness specifically, rather than physical interaction generally, is fundamental to this process remains disputed among serious physicists, and honesty requires leaving that dispute open rather than resolving it in favor of whichever answer sounds more appealing. Gödel's incompleteness theorem offers a genuine, rigorous mathematical result about formal systems, and a suggestive, though not proven, analogy to the relationship between thought and the awareness that witnesses thought. The analogy illuminates a structural pattern worth noticing directly in your own experience. It does not and cannot serve as mathematical proof of anything about consciousness itself. Wheeler's participatory universe remains a serious, carefully developed proposal within physics, taken seriously by some of the most respected physicists of the 20th century, and disputed by other equally serious physicists working from the same experimental data. It widens the space of genuine possibility without settling the underlying question in either direction. Idealism and Panpsychism both offer serious, carefully argued alternatives to physicalism, each one built specifically to address the hard problem that physicalism has never closed, and each one facing its own real, substantial objections in turn, objections their most serious proponents openly acknowledge rather than conceal. Spinoza's single substance offers an elegant philosophical framework that dissolves several of these tensions at once, through pure logical argument rather than empirical proof, a framework that happens to rhyme suggestively, though not conclusively, with certain threads in modern physics developed centuries later through entirely independent methods. And underneath every one of these positions sits the one piece of evidence requiring no outside argument at all, the direct, immediate, undeniable fact that experience is happening right now in you, whatever its ultimate explanation eventually turns out to be. So, plainly, honestly, without exaggeration in either direction, is consciousness the final reality? The honest answer, at the current edge of what careful inquiry has established, is that no one knows, with anything approaching certainty, and anyone who tells you otherwise, in either direction, is overstating what has actually been shown. What can be said honestly is that the old, comfortable assumption, the assumption that consciousness is obviously, simply, uninterestingly just a late byproduct of an indifferent physical universe, has lost the easy certainty it once seemed to have. The hard problem remains hard. The observer effect remains strange. Gödel's structural pattern remains suggestive. Serious physicists remain divided. Serious philosophers remain divided. And your own direct experience, right now, remains the one thing in this entire expedition that was never actually in question, whatever theory eventually turns. How to best explain it? There is something worth resting in, precisely at this point of honest uncertainty, rather than rushing past it toward a premature comfort in either direction. You do not need to know the final answer to this question in order to live well, to rest well, to be at peace with the mystery of your own existence tonight. The question is allowed to remain open. Some of the most serious, careful thinkers across history and across the present moment have left it open, not from confusion or laziness, but from a hard-won, disciplined honesty about the actual limits of what has so far been shown. Let your own mind rest now in that same disciplined, honest openness. There is a particular kind of peace available in no longer needing to force a premature answer onto a question this large, this old, and this deeply unresolved. Let the not knowing itself become restful, rather than something to anxiously chase after. The not knowing is, after all, simply an honest description of where things currently stand, and honest descriptions, however unresolved, tend to settle more peacefully into a tired mind at the end of a long night than false certainties ever could. In the final chapters ahead, we turn away from the weighing of arguments altogether and rest simply in what remains once the weighing is finished. Chapter 11. Living inside an open question. There is a particular kind of relief available once you have walked a long, careful chain of reasoning all the way through to its honest limits, the relief of no longer needing to keep reasoning at all, because you have finally arrived at the place where further reasoning genuinely runs out. We have walked across this long night through physics, through mathematics, through several centuries of careful philosophy, and arrived, honestly, at an open question rather than a closed answer. This is not a disappointing place to arrive. It is, in its own way, a more truthful place than false certainty would have been, and truthful places, even uncertain ones, tend to hold the person more steadily than comfortable illusions ever can. Notice something important about everything explored across this entire night. All of it, every experiment, every theorem, every philosopher's careful argument, has been an attempt to explain, describe, or locate something that you already have the most direct possible access to, right now, without needing any of it. The immediate fact of your own awareness was never waiting on the outcome of the physicalism versus idealism debate in order to be real. It has been fully, completely present the entire time you have been listening tonight, underneath every argument, every consideration, every honest admission of uncertainty. This suggests a particular way of holding the unresolved question we have been circling all night, one that does not require you to secretly believe one answer more strongly than the evidence actually supports, and does not require you to feel unsettled by the honest admission that certainty is not currently available. You can hold the question the way you might hold a stone smoothed by a very long river, turning it over slowly in your hand, noticing its different facets and textures, without needing to decide, tonight, exactly what kind of stone it ultimately is or where it originally came from. The holding itself can be restful, curious, unhurried, entirely separate from the pressure of needing a final verdict before you are allowed to relax. Notice, too, that this entire long exploration has, in its own way, already answered a different, quieter question, even while leaving the loudest question formally open. Whatever consciousness ultimately turns out to be, fundamental or emergent, ground of being or late biological accident, it is, right now, and this exact moment, worthy of far more attention and respect than it typically receives in the rush of ordinary daily life. Even the most conservative, strictly physicalist reading of everything explored tonight has to admit that consciousness remains the single most puzzling, least understood phenomenon in the entire body of human knowledge, more mysterious, by the honest admission of physicalists themselves, than anything else physics or biology has ever studied. That alone is reason enough to treat your own quiet awareness, right now, as something worth resting in and deeply, rather than rushing past on the way toward more seemingly urgent, more seemingly important daytime concerns. You do not need to resolve tonight's question in order to receive this much simpler, much more immediately available gift. The simple willingness to rest in your own awareness, without needing to fully explain it, without needing to win an argument about its ultimate nature, is available to you right now, regardless of how the larger philosophical debate eventually resolves, if it ever fully does. Let that willingness settle into you now, fully, without reservation. There is nothing more to figure out tonight. There was never actually a test waiting at the end of any of this. We move now into the final chapter, not to add anything further to the argument, but simply to close the night gently. The way along, unhurried piece of music slows and softens as it approaches its final, resolving note. Chapter 12, Closing Integration. We began this long night with a single question. Is consciousness the final reality? Across everything walked through since then, physicalism given its fairest hearing, the observer effect examined carefully and without exaggeration, Gödel's suggestive structural echo, Wheeler's disputed but serious cosmic proposal, Idealism and Panpsychism each given serious, honest consideration, Spinoza's elegant single substance, the grounded reassurance of quantum Darwinism, and finally, the one piece of evidence requiring no outside argument at all, your own direct, immediate awareness. Right now, we have arrived, honestly, not at a final answer, but at a far richer, far more carefully mapped uncertainty than the one we started with. That is not a small achievement, even though it may feel, at first, like less than what you were hoping for at the outset of a long night like this one. Most people move through their entire lives never once pausing to genuinely weigh this question with any real care, simply inheriting, unexamined, whichever assumption happened to be most common in their particular time and place, and mistaking that inherited assumption for settled, obvious fact. You have now walked through the actual terrain yourself, carefully, honestly, looking directly at the strongest case on every side, rather than settling for an easy answer handed to you second-hand. That itself is worth something, regardless of where the question ultimately, someday, gets resolved, if it ever fully is. You do not need to carry the specific details of tonight's long walk forward with you into tomorrow. The names, the theorems, the careful qualifications and disputes, all of it was scaffolding, useful for tonight's slow climb, but not the thing being climbed toward. What matters, what will quietly remain with you even as the specific words fade from memory, is the simple, settled sense that your own awareness, right now, whatever its ultimate nature eventually turns out to be, is not something small, obvious, or already fully explained. It is, by the honest admission of physicists, mathematicians, and philosophers across many centuries, one of the deepest remaining mysteries available to a human mind, and you carry direct, immediate, unmediated access to it every single moment of your life, waking or otherwise. Let your body continue resting exactly where it is now. There is nothing left to resolve tonight. There is no verdict waiting for you tomorrow, no requirement that you settle, once and for all, a question serious thinkers have been carefully circling for centuries without final resolution. The only thing being asked of you now is the same thing quietly asked of you throughout this entire long night. Simply rest. Simply notice that there is noticing happening, without needing to explain it, defend it, or resolve it any further. Let the open question you are settle, slowly, completely, into the deep, dreamless rest of sleep, the way every wave, however far it has traveled, however large it has grown, however uncertain its own nature may remain to itself, eventually, gently, returns to the quiet, unbroken stillness of the ocean it was never truly separate from in the first place. If this long, honest exploration has given you something worth returning to, subscribing to the channel means future explorations like this one will continue finding their way to you night after night, each one adding another careful, honest layer to the question of who and what you actually are. There is no urgency in that either. It will still be here whenever you are ready to return to it. For now, there is only this: the quiet room, the slowing breath, the open, unresolved, endlessly worthy question that has been resting here with you this entire night, not as a burden, but as a kind of company, the oldest company you have ever had, present with you now exactly as it has always been. The question remains open. You were never required to close it tonight.